Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. As you can guess by the title of the video, this video is all about, so you're interested in buying a telescope, but unlike a lot of websites or videos that might be out there, I'm not necessarily going to go into the numbers. I'm really going to try to explain this from I just want to look at the moon. I just want to look at the sun. I just want to look at galaxies. I might be interested in astrophotography, and at a really high level, give you some tips on what to consider when trying to pick a telescope. Now, these aren't all my telescopes. I actually have more telescopes than this, but I really want to show these telescopes to give a demonstration of what you really need to consider before you go out and buy a telescope. Now, if you listen to a lot of my videos, the constant theme that I say is, if you don't use it, it's not worth it. If it's too heavy to go out, if it's too cumbersome to set up, if it's too bothersome to go through all that process, you're not going to use it. It doesn't matter how powerful it is. It doesn't matter how great images you can get. It doesn't even matter how great things you can see. If it's too much of a bother to take it to a location, to take it out to your deck, to take it out to your yard, you're not going to use it, and it's just going to sit in your house collecting dust until you decide to sell it. Therefore, I am showing two of my telescopes. This is the refractor. This is my Nexstar SE8, which is a Chismet Cassegrain. And I'm going to provide a demonstration as to what things you probably should look for when trying to decide what telescope to get. Because it's not always about price. You have to think about what you want to see, what you think you might do in the future, and combine those things to make a decision as to what telescope to get. So let's start with a few things. You have the telescope, you have the mount. Again, telescope, mount. Now this has a guiding scope. Now this is going into a bit more of astrophotography, but I can explain this in a minute. This really isn't relevant for this video, but just in case you're wondering what this is my guiding scope for deep space astrophotography. So anyway, all right. So when it comes to trying to decide, and we'll just let the car pass for a minute. When trying to decide what type of telescope to get, the very first thing you need to think about is, what do you want to see? Because there's a telescope for everything. There's a telescope for the sun. There's a telescope for deep space objects. There's telescopes for planets. And there's telescopes for everything in between. So you kind of have to decide what you want to see. Some telescopes are good for observing the sun and the moon. Some telescopes are good for observing the planets. Some telescopes are good for observing deep space objects. So you kind of have to decide what you want to do. Then you have to decide, do I want to just do visual? Because that can make things much easier. Or I want to get into astrophotography, which complicates things, because then you start to having to go into more of the science of photography, focal length, aperture, eyepieces, all that matters. So when taking all these calculations, you first have to decide to do that. The second thing you have to decide to do is, that leads into what type of telescope do I want? Okay, so you might be wondering, well, why would I use this telescope as opposed to my refractor? Well, I'm trying not to go into the science of it, but the things you have to consider when looking for a telescope is the aperture. The aperture is basically this. It's how much light the telescope can receive. Because how much light, let me put this back on. Can you put this back on? How much light determines how bright the objects are. Because you have to remember, everything you're seeing up in the sky is pretty far away. And it takes a lot of time for that light to get here. So the telescope has to be able to capture that light. All this is doing is capturing light. And therefore, the wider it is, the more light you can get. But you can kind of see the trade-off. This is rather large, but it's much bigger. This right here is rather small, but it's much lighter. You can't get a lot of light with this refractor. You can get a lot of light with this Schmidt-Cassegrain. But again, this is much heavier. So you have to decide, okay, while I can see things, I might be able to see better things or things much clearer with this. This is a much heavier telescope than this. And therefore it's a pro and con. And that's the same thing for the Dobsonian. The Dobsonian is a much wider, much larger, much wider. You can see stuff, more distant stuff, more faint stuff, more but it's a much larger telescope. That's the second thing you have to consider. The third thing you really have to consider is the mount. Now you might be wondering, why do I care about the mount? Because you kind of have to put the telescope on something. And setting up the mount can be a process in and of itself. You have to think about what type of mount you want. You can get equatorial mount and all the equatorial mount, and you're probably wondering why these are angled, because the Earth is angled, and therefore these are designed to match the angling of the Earth, and therefore it can track how the objects are rotating, or more specifically, it matches the Earth's rotation. So it's designed that you can track the object in the sky as the Earth is rotating. Whereas you can get to an off-azimuth mount, which is a mount that up, down, left, right. And now if you're in the visual, that's probably the better mount for you, because those are much easier to set up, much easier to handle, and you don't have to worry about aligning it. Whereas if you decide to go with an equatorial mount, these are more designed for astrophotography, because in those type of discussions you have to track the object across the sky so you can get the images. So that's the second thing. The third thing, or the next thing you have to think about is the weight. This might not look it, but this is pretty heavy. You have to set it up so you take the telescope off, put this down. Whew. Now, this is about 5 pounds. Normally, I would leave this on, but I can lift this. But this is a very heavy. See, you kind of have to carry this around. Very, very heavy. But this isn't that expensive. This is very light. See how I'm not straining, but this is a very expensive mount. I say all that because the key thing to astronomy is really give and take. Now, I'll also post on after you decide what you want to look at, you also have to think about how the field of view. Are you interested in objects? Let's say you're looking at Jupiter and you don't want to get zoomed in, but and just you want clear sightings of the moon and the planets. That goes into focal length or in field of view. Are you interested in looking at the moon, but you don't want to be zoomed in? You want just to be able to see the sphere. Well, again, that's field of view, and that's the type of telescope you want. That concludes part one, because this is going to be a multi-part thing, and I don't want to waste anyone's time. But those are some of the things you probably need to think about when you're interested in buying a telescope. Leave any questions, anything you want to see, because next I'm going to go into eyepieces. I'll probably try to do a demonstration, show you some websites that can calculate all of this stuff for you so you don't have to think about it. But those are the basic things that you should probably consider when thinking about a telescope. Thank you very much. I hope this video was very helpful for you. Please leave any questions or statements or feedback in the comments, and I'll see you again.